adapted part of my curriculum to introduce life issues into second quarter. So just an overview of what I do. We teach, we read the Canterbury Tales, for example, Dr. Faustus, Macbeth, so all the classic kind of stuff. Great Expectations, Dracula. But books that I teach in the second quarter are Frankenstein and Brave New World. And these aren't necessarily my favorite books. I think they're great books. I think that probably if you look at the 19th century, one of the most significant books of the 19th century for our time is Frankenstein. And I know a lot of people in here probably read Frankenstein. It's probably been a long time since you read Frankenstein. If you haven't read Frankenstein, Frankenstein's probably about something different than you actually think Frankenstein's about. Same with Dracula, same with a lot of those other classics. So Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, which was written in the early 19th century, pre-Victorian actually. The second book is from the 20th century. And I really think, and again, even Aldous Huxley admitted later in his life, you know, this book wasn't that great as a work of literature, but it's an enduring classic because it speaks to our time. It speaks to the 21st century, and it tells us a lot about our own society. And I think if you haven't read that lately, if you go back to read that, your eyes will widen and you'll say, wow, these are the issues that we've been talking about here for the last 10 years. Specifically having to do with biotechnology, pro-life issues. And a lot of you probably know if you get up and start talking about pro-life issues, you say, hi, I'm pro-life. I'm going to talk about pro-life issues. This is pro-life. You turn a lot of people away all of a sudden. So what I do is this kind of an under-the-radar approach. I'm not trying to be deceitful or sneaky or anything. It's just, you know, just the way that it works. Is that we're touching on a lot of these important issues beyond abortion, and we know abortion is very, very important. And as I've been watching the news over the last 15 years, I've been saying to myself, wow, we're going to really have a lot of new life issues to deal with. And one of my goals is to equip the young people of today to understand what those issues are and to respond to them. And I'd just like to say a plug for some of my previous students, some of whom are here, and some who are obviously, most of them are not here, but they've been very receptive to all this. And they say, aha, wow, I get it. And they're not necessarily going around like, oh, I'm a pro-life person. They are. That's what's really interesting. The kids who are in high school have that natural sense of surprise and understanding when you start talking about these things. They haven't had a lot of the baggage to carry around that the media has given us, that college has given us. And I just like to say, I don't know if anyone in here studied Frankenstein in college. Okay, you did. So one, and I think it's better to study probably in high school because, as you probably know, depending on where you go, whether you go to a Catholic college or a Christian college or a secular college, it probably doesn't matter. The professor that you have usually has a particular kind of lens, and Franciscan I'm sure is different.
We have no lens.
At least I'm hoping that Frankenstein is not about all the things that I'm going to talk about here now. It's about feminism. It's about homosexualism. It's about whatever ism that you can think of. And I'm reading through, and I've read lots of essays on, not by my students, but by college students or just in academia in general. And they are saying Frankenstein is about a lot of things, and I'm scratching my head. I just don't see. So a lot of times I tell my students, when you get into college, you're gonna have to understand where your professor is coming from. So obviously, I'm kind of doing the same thing, aren't I? I'm coming from a pro-life perspective, and I admit that to everyone here. In the last couple of years, I've found a great book. I'm hoping that some of you have been introduced to this. If you haven't, I highly recommend it. It is Our Post-Human Future, Consequences of the Biotech Revolution by Francis Fukuyama. Speaking of professors in universities, he's a professor at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore. And what interests me about him is that he says straight up, my book is warning about the consequences of the biotechnology revolution, but I'm not going to be coming from a religious perspective. He says the religious perspective is important, and it is true. But we need to move beyond that. We need to look at, kind of go back to the Aristotelian view of nature. Okay, so these are the three books that I teach together. Frankenstein first. Our Post-Human Future ties the themes of both of these together. Here are my class goals as I present them to the students. One, to understand the literary themes of the two novels. Okay, pretty ordinary. Two, to make connections between these novels and the contemporary issues that our post-human future brings up, mainly biotechnology issues. And that includes abortion, okay, specifically eugenic selection and all that kind of stuff. Number three, to understand the underlying moral and ethical considerations of contemporary biotechnology and medical or scientific experimentation. And there's a lot of this today. And my students love to learn about this stuff. They see it as change of pace, very intriguing. There's elements of sci-fi in it. Okay, so a lot of the science fiction from the 19th and 20th century is becoming science practice. Okay, some of these things that we've been imagining in the past are coming to be. We have the ability to do these. The question that Fukuyama asks is, just because we can do it, should we do it? Okay, and the answer that he provides is, no, we shouldn't. Okay, and that's what kind of attracts me to that book. Number four, to learn how to compose effective arguments, especially in the essay format, and to learn how to synthesize ideas of others into an effective research paper. So someone might have uncrystallized ideas that are pro-life or whatever, but they need to learn how to pull in other literature and work that into their own thoughts so that it's more crystallized and it makes more sense. These are the guiding questions for this unit that I teach. What is human dignity? Okay, a lot of students have never thought before about what is human dignity? What does that mean? And when I came in a little bit late, but I came in on the dog discussion, which I thought was interesting. Where's the dog lady? There's the dog lady. All right. I'm also an editor for the New Oxford Review, and we wrote an editorial on dog people. No offense to dog people. And it reminded me of being in Hyde Park in Cincinnati and walking by a woman who had a stroller. She strolled by, and I did a double take because it wasn't a baby in the stroller. It was a made-up poodle. It was very, very strange. Anyway, I was in California recently. It's even worse there. Okay. And why do I say this? Because we need to understand what human dignity is, as opposed to the dignity of an Irish wolfhound. Okay. What are human rights? What is personhood? This might be the first time that some of my students have ever really thought about these issues. What is human nature? Do we have a right to manipulate human nature? Okay. So once you understand that, do we have the right to act in a sense as God? Okay. When does one begin to be and cease to be human? Okay. We've been talking a lot about when does life begin, and when does life begin? Any student back there, Olivia, when does life begin? Okay, anybody want to differ with that? Okay, so we've been talking a lot about when life begins. We can come at that from a pro-life perspective, or we can say, well, at birth, right? Okay, I'm so many years old because I was born on a certain day. There's been a lot of argument about that. And then there's when does life end? When does human life end? When you cease to be a human? Well, there are some different answers to that now. Because if you manipulate the human body, if you manipulate the human person, if you manipulate human nature, when does the human cease to be human and be something else? Science, sci-fi, and these are some of the modern questions contemporary questions that we should be asking now. When does a person go beyond being human, or is it even possible? So there's a post-humanist movement. There's a transhumanist movement. Can I, Michael Rose, standing up here right now, do something to my body to become beyond human? Now again, it sounds sci-fi, but there are groups out there who are in favor of doing these things. And usually they're saying there's some benefit to this. And we'll talk about that in a moment. What are the ramifications of today's biotechnology revolution, just in general? And what does contemporary and classic literature have to say about today's biotechnology revolution? Okay, and specifically I'm talking about Frankenstein and Brave New World. All right, Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. One of the first science fiction novels, and these aren't the kind of science, when you think of science fiction, you probably don't think of Frankenstein. You probably think of Arthur C. Clarke or Ray Bradbury, one of the 20th century science fiction artists. where you have beings from outer space or something like that. But really, science fiction just means that anything that moves beyond what's really capable in science at that time. Okay, so she's imagining a man, Victor Frankenstein, who has figured out the elixir of life. He has figured out the secret to life, and he's going to be this Promethean figure who is going to come up with a new form of life that's better, it's improved, it's faster, stronger, all these things, and he thinks that they're good. He's so wrapped up in them that he's not asking himself the correct questions until later, until he gets into those unintended consequences. So with biotechnology, whenever you do something new, you use science. Okay? When you are manipulating human nature, there are going to be consequences. Usually they're unintended, they're often unwanted, okay, at least by a large number of the people. Also, one of the first horror novels, of course, right? If I show you a picture of this, you all say, Frankenstein, yeah, right? You dress up as Frankenstein. This is Frankenstein's monster, but not Frankenstein himself. And also Gothic. And most importantly, I think it's a cautionary tale. And a lot of professors or teachers of literature would probably disagree with me. And we could have long arguments about whether this is a cautionary tale and whether this woman, Mary Shelley, had that in mind. Okay, and I don't, that's neither here nor there, but she did write something, and I'm evaluating it that way. And you can do the same. Anybody know how old Mary Shelley was when she wrote this book? Greg?
19, I thought.
Yeah, she was 19 years old. Just a 19-year-old, which is pretty amazing. She didn't write much of any work after that was published, but it was Frankenstein. So the subtitle is called A Modern Prometheus. And many of you will remember the Greek Titan entrusted with making mankind. So this is where the modern Prometheus is Frankenstein thinking that he can do the same thing, even though that he is not ordained by the gods or by God to do that. Okay, so again, a modern parable that man should not attempt to play God, because this is what Victor Frankenstein does. And because he does this, he comes to a bad end. Okay, and this is tragedy. Tragedy kind of works this way in literature, in drama. He is the eldest son of the Swiss Frankenstein, so he's Swiss, but he travels all around Europe during the course of the novel. He's the narrator of some of the story. It's a story within a story within a story, and Robert Walton is another character who's in there who's trying to discover the North Pole, and he's operating on hubris as well, and he himself comes to a bad end. He has this story and ambition, the same sort of story and ambition that Macbeth had. The same sort of story and ambition that Dr. Faustus had, if you're familiar with those characters from the Elizabethan time. Like I said, he discovers this secret to life, okay? And he never really says what the secret to life is. And why doesn't he say what the secret to life is? Because he doesn't want you to know, okay? So he's acting like this is not a novel, but it's real life. And if I told you, you might be able to do this, and I don't want you to misuse it. So it's kind of there's a kind of irony there. He understands. It's like figuring out how to create a nuclear bomb and saying, well, I know how to do it, and I'm going to make one. But I don't want you to do it because you might use that against me or you might misuse it. It's the same sort of thing. Again, he has this idea of a new race. Okay. The monster is called the demon or the daemon in throughout. He's a hideous-looking creature. So imagine Victor Frankenstein. He goes off to college in Germany at Ingolstadt, and he locks himself up basically in his fourth-floor apartment and for several years. And he's very, very manic and obsessive, and he's putting all this together. Is he a malicious man? No. Okay. He really thinks that what he is doing, because he has figured this out, is something that's good for mankind. This is the principle that he operates on. And it's only after those eyes open and he sees the quasi-humanity of his creation that he realizes, this thing is ugly. It is horrific. And what does he do? He runs away. Okay, he runs away from it. He becomes sick for a while, and they can't find Frankenstein, the monster. All right, so we have here a guy who's rejected, and the guy being the monster. And he's kind of a sweet, nice guy who just wants to learn French. He wants to read the classics. His favorite author is Milton. I mean, come on. He's a nice guy, but anytime anybody sees him, they're horrified, and you can imagine they're running away. He feels rejected and all that. So what does he do? He takes his revenge out on Victor Frankenstein and his family and everybody that he knows. He says, I'm taking you down, I'm taking everybody else down. I won't go into the whole story, but you kind of get the idea probably. The central things, again, as a cautionary tale, man should not attempt to play God. His creation might turn upon him. And this is completely the fault of Victor Frankenstein. Sometimes I say, all this death that happens in Frankenstein, is it the fault of the monster or is it the fault of Victor Frankenstein? And that makes for an interesting essay. Okay, does it go back to Victor Frankenstein? Okay, and there's if you answer yes to that, it's easily supportable. Also, this idea of actions having unintended consequences. Okay, so we talk about being blinded. Being morally blinded. Dr. Faustus was morally blinded when he made a deal with the devil, okay, for all worldly powers for 24 years. Macbeth was blinded by the three witches and their prophecies. Okay? It made him think that he could be the king of Scotland, and he would do anything that he needed to do in order to do that. They all came to a bad end. Victor Frankenstein comes to a bad end. Then we make some contemporary connections here. And I show pictures like this that are not real. Okay, so we have not created these, but these are sci-fi sort of sculptures here and montages from Photoshop. But these are Fukuyama's primary points when he's making these connections. And he actually does write about A Brave New World at the beginning of his book. The Christian tradition maintains that man is created in God's image, which is the source of human dignity. But like I said earlier, he says we should go beyond that. The use of it's a violation of God's will. But religion is not the only grounds for which one could understand what it means to be human. Okay, we can go back to that Aristotelian human nature idea. Okay, human nature itself has a special role in defining what's right and wrong, what's important, what's not important, what's just and what's unjust. Okay. And then what my students are doing is they're researching these topics and trying to figure out, are they just or unjust? Are they moral or immoral? Are they ethical or unethical? Should they be allowed? Should they be restricted? Should they be banned? So they break up into groups, and these are the general categories that they're researching. And I'd like to say, if it's not apparent already, I'm not an expert on biotechnology. And there are probably some people sitting in the audience here that are, and maybe shaking their heads. But what I am is an assimilator. I'm trying to make connections, and that's what we try to do in education, try to make those connections. That's what part of critical thinking is about. So human cloning, genetic engineering, this whole new concept of designer babies. Okay, test tube babies have been around for a while, but creating your own designer baby from a menu. Transhumanism and posthumanism, moving beyond somehow what it means to be a human. Okay, we have special powers in some way that we're really not supposed to have. Selective reduction eugenics, animal-human hybrids. Okay, this is kind of like the joke version of that. But chimeras have been in the news, in the science and technology sections of important newspapers and magazines over the last, especially 5 years. Embryonic beauty treatments. I won't even go into what that is. That's so ridiculous. And neuropharmacology, or the psychotropic drugs, which change the chemistry of the brain so that it changes the nature of the human person. Okay, and it's not to say that there aren't positives to all of these things, or at least some of them. Some of them there are no positives, believe me. So what I want them to do in putting all this together is do the research, and actually Paula Westwood, I credit her as giving me a lot of really good leads of what are good sources for learning about all these things. And so I admit I'm very directive in the way that I want them to do the research, and I'm guiding them to sites that are very, very informative. If you just Google this stuff or go on Wikipedia, there's a lot of garbage. Okay, so anytime you're doing research on the internet, and really anytime you're doing research in any kind of way in academia, you really have to have a filter. You have to understand what's credible and what's not credible. So I'm directing them to credible sources, I should say. So they have a written, oral, and visual part of this, and they're starting out with the definition. What is their topic? Okay, they have to define. Most of them don't know exactly what it is when they get it assigned. What is transhumanism? How many in here could define transhumanism right now? Not very many people. And a few years ago, I had never heard of transhumanism. I had never heard of posthumanism. I had no idea there was a difference between posthumanism and transhumanism, but there is. And then the rationale. explain why the researchers or the medical people or the whoever it is that's interested in this and doing this research, why do they want to do this? Okay, and they find out it's not usually because they want to be like Victor Frankenstein or Macbeth. It's because they think there's some sort of rationale, and usually it's either scientific or it's medical, and they're going to solve some sort of medical problem. Okay, you're probably all familiar with the embryonic stem cell debate. Okay, so there are people who will say, yeah, this is a good thing. Okay, this is gonna heal people. This is gonna solve some medical problems. This is gonna advance science and technology in some way. Then the ethics. I'll have them look into the ethics, and they have to include what the Catechism of the Catholic Church has to say about this issue. And of course, if you look up transhumanism in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, Father Seminarian, what does it say? It doesn't say anything, right? Okay, because it's not incorporated into that yet. But you kind of go into the umbrella of biotechnology, and the Catechism does have many things to say about that. The next thing they're doing is coming up with the pros and cons. And in the end, a lot of them are finding, wow, there are a few cons, or there are a few pros, but the cons really outweigh those pros. And now we really have to consider whether this this topic should be pursued as a biotechnological pursuit. Then the unintended consequences. What are some of the unintended consequences that have resulted from the experimentation? Okay, for example, let's just go back to test tube babies. Okay, so test tube babies, which is very Brave New World-ish, have resulted now, they say, in after 20, how long has it been? 30 years since the first test tube babies, and so these people are adults now, and they're finding that they have a lot of similar physical disabilities. Okay, and they are possibly traced back to this being in vitro fertilization process. And then the issue in literature. Frankenstein and Brave New World are not the only two novels or pieces of literature that deal with these things. And then they have to form a stance. Okay, what stance are they taking on this? Should this be regulated by the government? Should it be banned by the government? Is it ethical? Is it unethical? Okay, and it depends on the topic which one they're going to address. And so all of this is a good way to teach the argumentative essay, research skills, and all of that. So I am going to quickly go through what I do with the Bodies exhibition. This is the Bodies exhibition came, I'm saying like 2010 or 2009 to the Cincinnati Museum Center, and it's very controversial because these were human beings. These are real human bodies. So they had to do an in-class essay on this, and they're asking, should the Cincinnati Museum sponsor this? Should they have done that? Okay, and they have to read 5 different sources. One's the museum promo brochure, which of course is touting it, saying this is a wonderful thing, it's so educational, it's a chance in a lifetime. And of course, even the Catholic schools all signed on to this, and they're ready to go down, and Archbishop Walton said, hey, wait a minute. This is not something we want to be a part of. And so he actually came down and said, if you want to go with your parents. We're not going to do it through the Catholic school system. That was very controversial. And I have some of the students who are beneficiaries of that, or when I first started teaching, they remember that and remember not being able to go, and some of them had a little bit of an attitude about that. Don't worry, I took care of that. One was an editorial that said this was a freak show. It was kind of overboard, and the editorial was, but it was good. And then an editorial by Father Michael Seeger, who wrote from the perspective of respect for the body. And an Enquirer editorial, of course, it inspires debate and it's educational. So if it's educational, therefore it's good. Okay, one of the great fallacies of our time. I'm going to skip through this, but you can kind of imagine what we're doing with this, trying to get them to see, again, what is human dignity? Where do these bodies come from? If they're unclaimed bodies, can we use them for anything? I mean, that's the big question here. And a lot of people will say, yeah, we can, because they're unclaimed, so we might as well use them for educational purposes. Why not? Okay, and I would say to a student, well, what if you found out that later that was your grandma? Would it change anything? Well, it shouldn't change anything from your perspective, we should still be able to look at your grandma and all of her whatevers, all over the place. They're not just naked, the skin is peeled back, right? So we're looking at the spiritual or moral aspect of this as well. The last thing I want to go through this. I only got a couple minutes here left, but we come up with thesis statements about, this is an example of one, although bodies is the exhibit, may be unethical, immoral, and an offense against human dignity. As some critics claim, the exhibition should still be hosted by the Museum Center because of its unique educational value. Okay, that was the thesis statement that I got a few years ago. This was another one. The Museum Center should not be hosting bodies because the exhibition is immoral in its treatment of human corpses, and there are a number of much less controversial ways of educating the public about human anatomy and health, which I thought was a pretty sound way. You acknowledge the opposition, and then you say why your position is better. And we follow this up with a study of the fallacies. Okay. I'm going to skip over to, we do a research paper on it. Okay. Then, just want to get to Brave New World real quick. Brave New World has so many connections after we read our post-human future, after the students have kind of an idea of what these biotechnological issues are, and they have this kind of, wow, I can't believe this stuff is going on. I thought this was just science fiction. Well, it's not. And then they read Brave New World. And Brave New World is a society in which all of this stuff is going on. No one is any longer born of live parents, except on this reservation where the savages live. Okay, everyone is born through through the test tube baby process. Okay, so no one has parents. In fact, in the beginning of the book, they make the narrator makes it apparent that if you use even the word mother, they think it's pornographic. It's disgusting. And the idea of fatherhood is disgusting. So the family is destroyed. The idea of personhood has been destroyed. And we also read 1984, which I think is an interesting book to read. And when you're studying dystopias, it has a lot to tell us about 20th century society, and also has a lot to tell us about ourselves. But Brave New World, I think, is even more important, because we're living in more of a society that's like Brave New World. We are all amusing ourselves to death. We're on Selma holidays. Selma is the drug, like Prozac, but without the side effects. So we talk about what a utopia is, what a dystopia is, and then make some connections between the 20th century horrors of the Soviet communism and German Nazism. But not only that, students know all about that kind of stuff, at least in some way. But they have never really thought about Western consumerism as a problem. Okay? And in Brave New World, this idea of Western consumerism is a big problem. How long do you wear your clothes? Not very long. If there's a tear in them, you throw them out. You get new clothes in Brave New World. And there are some people who kind of live like this. We no longer make materials to last for very long. We want to look good in a short time. We want instant gratification with whatever it might be, and that is it's a problem. Also, modernism, this idea of breaking with the past. Anything that has happened in the past is, as Henry Ford said, bunk, which means it doesn't matter. If it happened in the past, it's not as good as what we have going on today. Again, that's modernism. You can apply that to any number of pursuits. Okay? Technological mass production, that's the third. But the Brave New World Society it portrays a socially engineered society, okay, where no one really has any human freedom, but no one cares that they don't have any human freedom because they're all having so much fun. Okay? Or at least they think that they are. And of course, there's a protagonist who realizes, hey, wait a minute. There's more to life than all of this drug stuff, this drug culture, this sex culture. And interestingly enough, Aldous Huxley's writing in 1932 about the dividing procreation and the sexual act. Okay, and this was around the time of the Lambeth Conference and all that. So he realized what would happen, okay, if we continued in the same trajectory. And the culture is driven by technology. Biotechnology, but also amusement technology. And the more contraptions you have, the better amusement it is. So it's a great critique of consumerism, technology worship, And this idea of mass media hypnotism, when we have at the advertising industry or the media news repeating the same sound bites over and over and over and over, kind of in a way, if you're not using your critical thinking capacities, it will take you over, and you will make the assumptions that what you're hearing over and over and over are true, just because you've heard them so many times. This is how this society of Brave New World operates, and it really resonates because we can see that if we're thinking critically today. Can I go on for another half an hour or so? There are a few other things that I want to say just to wrap it up, but the human beings here in this society are treated like Model Ts. So Model T was invented by Henry Ford. So religion was supplanted by a quasi-god by the name of Henry Ford. It's not really the real Henry Ford, but it's Henry Ford as remembered through all these people in society. So instead of making the sign of the cross, they make the sign of the T. Okay? There's no longer an Archbishop of Canterbury. There's an the Arch Community Songster of Canterbury. So it's no longer about, the Canterbury Cathedral is no longer about worshiping God, it's about worshiping each other. Does this sound familiar? Okay. The family is seen as something obscene, and you have the same problem in 1984 in a more totalitarian way. The whole system of people in Brave New World is the alphas, betas, the gammas, the deltas, the epsilons. So everyone is conditioned, they're socially conditioned from birth onward in order to enjoy what it is that, whatever job that they have, whatever they are destined to do in life. So happy people make good workers. That's the whole idea. Okay, so if you're an epsilon, you're someone who's going to be working class, sweeping the floors or being a janitor or whatever it might be, and you're going to be very, very happy with doing that, and you're not going to think of anything any further than that. The alphas are where you get into some of the problems, and these are where our protagonists come from. The ones that are a little bit too smart for their own good in that society, and they're the ones who rebel and end up coming to a bad end. Okay, and it's a tragedy because they do the right thing, rather than a tragedy because they did the wrong thing. All right. And this whole idea of designer babies is in Brave New World. And we can see this more and more now, and if you read Brave New World, you're just like, how is this guy so prescient? How did he know all of these things would happen in the 21st century? And some of them were already happening in the late 20th century. There are fertilizing rooms, egg harvesting. These are the same sorts of terms that we're going to be hearing more and more over the next decade. This idea of egg harvesting. There are women who go to college, and there are advertisements in the Ivy League newspapers that say, we want to harvest your eggs because you're a smart person and you're probably good looking too. Okay? And we'll give you $15,000. And so that some of these women are in the state of desperation, at least they think. Okay, they need $15,000 to be able to stay in school or whatever it might be, so they go to these harvesting rooms and harvesting companies. And there's an excellent video that some of my students watch and talk about and tell the others about if they have studied that particular pursuit. They're all decanted rather than being born. There's also issues of communism, but ultimately we have a dystopia that is relevant to our society today. Okay, in a way, we're kind of stepping into that dystopian society. Okay, and the reason that authors write dystopias normally, unless they're deranged, are to warn others in our society, if we keep going on this trajectory, this is where we're going to end up. This is what's going to happen, or this at least could potentially be what happens. And so a lot of authors, a lot of the good authors, the classic authors, think of Dickens, were critics of their own society. Okay, and by being critics of their own society, they were able to make change for the better. And so that's what we would hope by students, understanding these issues and kind of thinking about these issues. And I remember telling them when they're doing their presentations, and they're all passionate about it, at least some of them are, that you guys are going to be the ones who are professionals, politicians, doctors, somebody, a scientist. You're going to be the ones dealing with these issues over the next 20 years. And so I'm hoping to, by the time that they leave, they have some critical thinking skills and they know what to think about at the same time. I've probably used up all my time. Do you have any time for questions? Two questions, all right.
I was just wondering if you'd seen the movie Gattaca, what you thought of it.
I haven't seen the movie Gattaca yet, but you want to give a brief synopsis of this because I've heard about it and it's relevant?
Organica is also a world in which people are genetically engineered to be whatever their parents wanted them to be. And it's the battle between the non-superior genetic creature and the superior genetic creature. And the theme is there's no genome for the human spirit.
Okay, that's great, and that's exactly, and we're going to see more and more of these kinds of sci-fi thrillers. Okay, and some of them are going to not appear necessarily as sci-fi, but they still use that technology. There's another movie, the one with Bradley Cooper. He takes this pill, and he can. What's the name of that?
Limitless.
Limitless, yes. So Limitless is also kind of like our psychopharmacology, and you have the law of unintended consequences. Okay, time for one more question. In the back.
I was just wanting to know if you had read the book The Giver.
Yeah, The Giver by Lois Lowry, is that what you're talking about? Yeah, a lot of students read that in middle school these days. And I have to say, unfortunately, you're bringing up things I haven't read and seen. So I look like not very well qualified. I've read a lot, I've seen a lot of movies. But I've heard really good things about that, and when we are studying these things, that The Giver comes up. So I can't give you my own opinion. One last question.
Animal Farm.
Yeah, Animal Farm by George Orwell, who wrote 1984, and that's about the society in an allegorical sense. Yeah. One last question.
I just wonder what percentage of this class could you teach in a public school setting do you think?
I think I could teach all of it in a public school setting. I would just have to be very careful of how I did that, and that's a really good question. But I think I could do it without somebody saying, you're transgressing some sort of religious issue or.
I was going to say, I'm a retired public school teacher from Veteran. You could have taught this if you didn't bring in the Catholic catechism. I mean, they're teaching people.
Right. So just like Francis Fukuyama says, he said there is a religious standpoint, but we can look at other standpoints. We don't even need to mention religion. So it's not a religious issue, primarily. I mean, you could say it is primarily, but it's not solely. Right?
I teach UBC, and one of the first things I tell my students is this is a public university, which does not mean that you have to be an atheist to come here. Everybody has their own views. We all come from our own backgrounds. We have people that are Hindu, Jewish, Catholic, whatever. So what public means to me is that everybody has a right to express their views and be respected for them. So you can say whatever it is your background, allows you to, kind of throw on at other people, but you have to be respected.
Yeah.
And that's how I handle it.
Yeah. Well said. Yeah. If everyone was like you, that'd be great. All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rose.